This is the last week in our series on spiritual formation, the series God Shapes Us. And you might remember that it's kind of deliberate that we're phrasing it that way, that God shapes us, because God is the primary actor in our relationship. We work along with God, but God provides the direction. God provides the energy. God is the primary one who provides the love that motivates us to become the people that God has made us to be. And we started out with the idea that it's even a gift from God that we have a desire to follow Christ. That seed of faith, the way we would say it in our tradition, that seed of faith is planted in our hearts by God and nurtured by God, so that we even have that desire to live in that new way, to follow Jesus. And as that seed grows, God starts to take away the things that would hold us back. You know, the attitudes that make it more difficult for us to do the right thing. The personality traits that make it harder for other people to get along with us. The addictions that make our lives more miserable and prevent us from living as abundantly as God would desire us and invite us to live. That God starts to work on those things, starts to get those things away. And as we progress in the spiritual life, we meet God in various places. There are things that we can do to open ourselves to God's presence. So we can spend time in silence. We could spend time in silence like the prophet Elijah. Elijah experienced all kinds of incredible manifestations of God's power. But when it came right down to it, his most profound experience of God was in the sound of sheer silence. And it can be the same for us, that in those silent times, God's real presence can be real to us. And yet, we're human. So we sometimes need, that's not the only way that we relate to God. We can also relate to God through our imaginations. And that our imaginations are a real gift from God. So that we can use our imaginations to help us see the reality that God really is active in the world, that God really does show up. And in places where God promises to show up like Holy Communion, we could use our imaginations to remind ourselves and help make real that God is really here, that God really is here. We believe it, and our imaginations can help us make that more real for ourselves. So we work with God. And one of the ways that we work with God in order to have the life that God wants us to have is even in our struggles. You know, even in the times where we have to kind of wrestle with God because things don't make sense, because things are difficult, because it's just not the way that we know that it ought to be. We wrestle with God like Jacob in this story that we have this morning. Now you might remember, Jacob came from a very dysfunctional family. In fact, Jacob was a large cause of the dysfunction in his family. Jacob was a twin, and his older by a few minutes brother Esau grew up together. Now one day Esau was out hunting and he got really hungry, and he came back to the camp, and Jacob said, "Well, I would be happy to give you something to eat if you sign over all the inheritance to me. Just give me all the inheritance, and here's a nice delicious bowl of lentil stew. Isn't that a deal?" Well, I guess when you're hungry, your brain doesn't work that well, because Esau went for the deal, ended up giving his inheritance over to Jacob. But it gets worse, because later, when their father Isaac is very, very old and dying and blind, he's ready to bless Esau. He's ready to pass on the leadership of the family to Esau as the eldest son. And he says to Esau, "Go out and hunt for me, get me some nice game, make a little meal for me, and then I'll bless you." Well, Jacob disguises himself as Esau, comes in, "Oh, Dad, I'm Esau. Here's food." And Isaac falls for it, blesses Jacob. Jacob deceives his father, steals the blessing and the leadership of the family from his older brother. And of course, his older brother is not happy about this and wants to kill him. So Jacob runs away. He runs hundreds of miles away to Uncle Laban's house. And there at Uncle Laban's house, he finds love. Laban's daughter, Rachel, is very beautiful, and he says to Laban, I really want to marry Rachel. And Laban says, well, here's the deal. You work for me for 7 years, then you can marry Rachel. And Jacob is so love-struck, he's like, that 7 years seems like 15 minutes. And boom, they're having the wedding, they're having the big celebration. Jacob gets a little too rambunctious, drinks a little too much wine, and he wakes up the next morning in bed next to Rachel's older sister, Leah. Oops. Laban had pulled the old switcheroo. Because Laban says, well, in our culture, the older daughter always gets married first, but here, I'll tell you what, work for another 7 years, and then you can marry Rachel. Jacob, who had deceived his father, gets one pulled over on him too. And so he works another 7 years. And after that, he takes Rachel and Leah and all the livestock that Laban has given him, and he starts to head home. And he hears that his brother Esau knows that he's coming. And Esau has formed a welcoming committee to welcome him back home. A welcoming committee of 300 armed men. So Jacob starts getting a little nervous. He sends, he's thinking this is not going to end well. He sends his family across the river, and he kind of takes some time by himself to figure out what's next. And that's where we hit this story. He's alone, and this stranger shows up and wrestles with him. And I think Jacob is wrestling with God, but he's also wrestling with himself. There's a lot of layers to this story. But I think one thing that clearly is happening here is Jacob is struggling to redefine who he is. He's done a lot of bad things in his life. He's had some pretty rank things done to him too. Where is he going to go from now? How can the future be better than the past? And he's wrestling with this. He's wrestling with God, trying to figure out what to make of this. And he doesn't want to let go. Now, the stranger touches his hip and dislocates it. So, obviously, the stranger, who turns out to be God, could have won this wrestling match at any time. That's not the point, right? But from then on, Jacob has a reminder of this encounter. He walks with a limp. So for the rest of his life, he's reminded of this encounter where he craves a blessing. He craves a new start. He craves a new identity. And the thing is that is precisely what God gives him right there in the wrestling. He says, what's your name? Jacob. What's your name? Deceiver. That's what Jacob means. What's your name? Grasper. It's another meaning of Jacob. The deceiver. The person's always grasping at things that don't belong to him. And God says, no. Now your name's Israel. The one who struggles. The one who struggles and prevails. That's your new name. That's your new identity. That's who you are. And he goes on the next day to go and meet his brother. And the thing is, his brother can see that this isn't Jacob anymore. This is Israel. And the brothers reconcile. And Jacob says to Esau, when I looked at you, it was like looking at the face of God, because it was looking at the face of forgiveness. That brokenness was mended at the end of the struggle. And I think for a lot of us, that happens. Because all of us face things in our lives. We face bad things that we've done. We face terrible things that have happened to us. We face things that just happen in the world that are not good. And God works with us in the struggle. This passage from Romans, it's a verse that's quoted a lot. In all things, God works together for good to those who love God. And I think that's a better translation than what you will read in your bulletin. In the bulletin it says, all things work together for good. But that's not quite what it says. It's not that everything turns out okay. It's not that God uses every bad thing, or worse yet, sends every bad thing into your life in order to make you a better person. I mean, I don't think the tsunami that hit around Christmas in 2006 and killed all those people, I don't think God sent that tsunami to make those survivors better people because they lived through a tragedy. I don't think that. And my guess is that none of you think that either. So why would God send anything else bad into my life or into your life on purpose in order to make us better people? That's not the way God works. But in everything that comes our way, in all the struggles that come our way, in all the hardships that come our way, God works with us. In other words, God is sustaining us. As we struggle, and even as we struggle with God, God shapes us, God forms us, God strengthens us, God begins to give us a new identity, just like he gave to Jacob. And so at the end of the struggle, it's true, we might still walk with a limp. The things that we endure, the bad things that happen, the bad things that we see, they do have an effect on us. It's not like once we connect with God that all that stuff has magically never happened. That's not the way it works. But God works with us to sustain us, to strengthen us, and to give us that better life that comes out on the other side. So that even though those things that happen to us, those bad things, whether it's a sickness that we had or a sickness that a family member had, whether we're thinking about a death or a disaster, those bad things were not sent into our life by God. That abandonment was not because God wanted it to be that way, but that God is present with us to give us a new start, to give us a new chance, to give us a new life. Just like Jacob. Thanks be to God.